Your life as Napoleon Bonaparte from nobody to emperor, what it's like to be every level of the man who rewrote the world hook. The crown is in your hands. Not on your head yet. In your hands. Heavy. Gold. The Pope is standing 3 feet away, and the entire Cathedral of Notre Dame is packed with the most powerful people in Europe, and every single one of them is watching you. The Pope was supposed to crown you. That was the plan. That was the ceremony. That was how it had always been done. The church places the crown on the emperor's head, which means the church is above the emperor, which means God is above the emperor, which means you answer to something higher than yourself. You look at the crown in your hands. You look at the Pope. You place the crown on your own head. The silence in Notre Dame lasts exactly 2 seconds. Then the roar. You are 35 years old. 15 years ago, you were a broke Corsican cadet who couldn't afford the uniform regulations and ate dinner alone because the French boys wouldn't sit with a foreign scholarship student. You spoke French with an accent that made them laugh. Nobody is laughing now. But here's what nobody tells you about the moment you crown yourself Emperor of France. It's not the beginning of the story. It's not even close to the peak. It is the moment the trap closes. The moment the thing you spent your entire life building begins, quietly, inevitably, to build the walls of the cage you will die in. You don't know that yet. You're still holding the crown. Stay until level 8. Because the end of this story is not what history class taught you. And I need to know in the comments, when Napoleon placed that crown on his own head, was that the greatest power move in history or the moment he sealed his own fate? Drop your answer. Let's go. Level 1, the foreign kid. You are 9 years old, and you don't belong here. The military academy at Brienne-le-Château is in France. You are from Corsica. The island only became French the year before you were born, which means you grew up speaking Italian, thinking in Corsican, and arriving at a French institution where everyone already knows the rules and nobody bothered to tell you. Your father is minor nobility. Barely. The title exists, but the money doesn't. The scholarship that got you here covers tuition. It doesn't cover the things the other boys take for granted, the quality of the fabric, the extras, the ease of someone who has never had to calculate whether something is affordable. You calculate everything. The first rule of this world. You are always the outsider unless you make yourself indispensable. The French boys mock your accent. They call you the foreigner. One of them, during a snowball fight you organized and won with tactical precision at age 10, looks at you afterward with something that is not quite respect but is adjacent to it. You file that away. Military tactics produce respect faster than social grace. You cannot acquire their accent in time. You can acquire their respect through the only currency available to you. Competence so undeniable it cannot be ignored. You read everything. Not for grades. For architecture. The way campaigns are built. The way supply lines work. The way terrain determines outcomes before a single soldier moves. You read Caesar. Hannibal. Frederick the Great. You are not studying history. You're studying a system. And every system has rules. And if you understand the rules better than everyone else in the room eventually has to acknowledge you. At 15 you graduate and transfer to the École Militaire in Paris. The evaluation notes from your final examination read, "Will go far if circumstances permit." You are already past waiting for circumstances. Comment below. Have you ever been the outsider in a room who had to earn respect through pure competence? That's level 1 energy. Tell me your story. Level 2, the artillery officer. You are 16, and you are a second lieutenant in the artillery. The pay is 1,120 livres a year. After sending money home to your family, your father is dead. You are now the de facto head of a household that includes your mother and 7 siblings. You have approximately enough to eat adequately, and not much else. The artillery is where you want to be. Not infantry, where social connections and noble blood determine advancement. Artillery is technical. Artillery is mathematical. A cannon doesn't care about your accent. It cares about trajectory, powder charge, wind speed, and the precision of the calculation that puts the shot where it needs to go. You are exceptional at the calculation. The revolution arrives in 1789. You are 20. France is tearing itself apart, and the old rules about rank and nobility and whose family name opens which door are dissolving in real time. The system that disadvantaged you is collapsing. The new system rewards exactly what you have been building for 11 years: competence, decisiveness, and the specific kind of cold-blooded intelligence that performs better under pressure than in peace. The rule at level 2: revolutions don't create opportunities. They reveal them. The opportunity was always there. The old structure just prevented access. Now the structure is gone, and everyone is scrambling to understand the new rules. You already understand them because you never had the luxury of relying on the old ones. In 1793, a royalist rebellion holds the city of Toulon. The French Republican Army needs to retake the port. The officer in charge of artillery is wounded. Someone recommends you as a replacement. You are 24. You have never commanded in a real engagement. You spend 3 days studying the terrain. You identify one position, a specific hill, that controls the entire harbor. If you take that hill, the British ships supporting the royalists will be forced to withdraw. Everything else follows from that single point. You take the hill. Toulon falls in 17 days. The general who observes your work writes a letter to Paris. This officer has no equal in talent. You are promoted to brigadier general at 24. The room is starting to acknowledge you. Level 3, the general. The Italian campaign begins in 1796, and you are 26 years old commanding an army that is starving. The army of Italy hasn't been paid in months. The men's boots have holes. Morale is a concept they've heard about, but can't currently locate. The supply situation is so bad that your soldiers are surviving on what they can forage, which in the mountains of southeastern France in early spring means very little. You stand in front of them before the first engagement, and you say something that nobody in command has said to them in a long time. I am going to lead you into the most fertile plains in the world. Rich provinces, great cities will be in your power. There you will find honor, glory, and riches. It's a promise. It's also a recruitment pitch. It's also a psychological operation on your own army. It works. The Italian campaign runs 14 months. You fight and win 11 major engagements against Austrian forces that are better equipped, better supplied, and led by generals with decades of experience you don't have. You win because you move faster than they expect, attack where they are weakest rather than where convention dictates, and make decisions in hours that your opponents take days to make. The rule at level 3. Speed is a weapon. Every hour your enemy spends deciding is an hour you spend moving. The Austrian commanders are experienced in fighting the wars of the previous century. You are fighting the war of right now, and right now moves faster than experience can process. You also learn something harder at this level. You learn what it costs. After the Battle of Lodi, a bridge crossing under direct fire that you led yourself, standing at the front, that your soldiers afterward call you Le Petit Caporal for, the little corporal, a term of affection. You sit alone in your tent that night and you feel, for the first time, the specific weight of commanding men who died because you decided they should cross that bridge. You don't break. You file it. You keep moving. That is the first real cost. And you will pay versions of it for the next 20 years. Level 4, the myth. By 1798, you are the most famous soldier in France, and you are bored. Not personally bored. Strategically restless. France has been at war with Austria and Britain for years, and the political situation in Paris is unstable in the specific way that unstable political situations become opportunities for people who understand that power, like nature, abhors a vacuum. You understand this. The Egyptian campaign is partly genuine strategic thinking. Controlling Egypt would threaten British trade routes to India, and partly a calculated decision to stay visible, to keep adding to the myth, to ensure that your name continues to mean something while you wait for the moment in Paris to arrive. You bring scientists with you to Egypt. Scholars. Artists. You are not just conquering territory, you are framing yourself as a civilizing force, as someone who brings enlightenment along with military power. The optics are deliberate. Everything at this level is deliberate. The campaign is militarily mixed. You win on land. The British destroy your fleet at the Battle of the Nile and trap your army. You eventually leave, quietly, before the army's full situation becomes clear, and return to France. The rule at level 4. Narrative is as important as reality. What France knows about Egypt is not the stranded army. It is the victories, the scholars, the monument to French glory. You control the information. Not through censorship, exactly, through emphasis. You understand, years before the concept has a name, that the story of events is a separate object from the events themselves, and that the story is the one that travels. You arrive in Paris in October 1799. The political situation is exactly what you expected. The Directory, France's five-man governing council, is incompetent, corrupt, and hated. 2 of the 5 directors are your allies. On the 18th Brumaire, November 9th, 1799, you walk into the council chambers with soldiers. The coup takes 2 days. You are 30 years old. You are now first consul of France. Level 5, the consul. The consulate is the most productive period of your life, and nobody remembers it correctly. Everyone knows the wars. Nobody remembers that between 1799 and 1804 you reorganize the entire French legal system, create the Napoleonic Code, a unified legal framework that still forms the basis of law in over 40 countries, reform the tax system, establish the Bank of France, create the lycée educational system, and negotiate a concordat with the Catholic Church that stabilizes French religious life after a decade of revolutionary chaos. You work 18-hour days. You dictate letters at a pace that exhausts secretaries in rotation. Your mind operates in parallel streams: military, administrative, diplomatic, financial, and you move between them with the same speed you used to move between tactical positions in Italy. The rule at level 5. Power must produce results or it produces rivals. Every competent thing you do makes you harder to remove. Every institution you build binds France's interests to your continued presence. You are not just governing, you are making yourself structurally necessary. In 1802, a plebiscite makes you consul for life. The vote is 3.5 million in favor, 8,000 against. You don't believe the numbers are accurate. You know they were managed. But 3.5 million versus 8,000 is a usable ratio, regardless of its precision. The people around you have changed. The soldiers and administrators who surrounded you in Italy have been replaced by courtiers, ministers, functionaries who have learned that the fastest path to advancement is agreement. You notice this. You're not pleased by it. But you also don't stop it because the alternative, being surrounded by people who challenge you, is slower, and slow is the one thing you cannot afford. That is the second real cost. And you won't fully understand it until much later. Question for the comments. At what point does surrounding yourself with loyal people become surrounding yourself with yes men? Is there a way to avoid it when you're at the top? I'm genuinely asking. Level 6, the Emperor. The crown scene you saw at the beginning, Notre Dame, December 2nd, 1804, the Pope, the self-coronation, makes complete sense by now. You didn't take the crown from the Pope to be theatrical. You took it because the act communicates something precise. Your authority does not derive from God or church. It derives from yourself, from the revolution, from the will of the French people as expressed through you. You are not a king by divine right. You are an emperor by historical force. The distinction matters to you. Whether it matters to history is a different question. The empire at its peak controls or influences territory from Spain to the borders of Russia. You have placed your brothers on the thrones of Holland, Spain, and Westphalia. Your sisters govern Italian territories. You have remade the map of Europe the way a general remakes a battlefield, by identifying the positions that matter and occupying them before your enemies can. But the rule at level 6 is the one that begins to break everything. Empires require continuous expansion to justify themselves. The costs of the military machine, the men, the material, the logistics of maintaining armies across a continent, require a level of resource extraction that only works if you keep winning and keep absorbing new territory and new tax bases. You know this. You know it is not sustainable. You keep going, because stopping feels like losing, and you have built an identity so completely around forward momentum that you cannot locate the version of yourself that would know how to stop. Josephine cannot give you an heir. You divorce her in 1809. It is the most personal cost so far. She is the one person who has known you since before the myth fully formed. Divorcing her is also the most rational decision available. Dynastic stability requires an heir, and the rationality makes it worse, not better. You marry Marie-Louise of Austria in 1810. In 1811, she gives you a son, Napoleon II, the King of Rome. You hold him and feel something you cannot file away. Level 8. The island. There are 2 islands. Elba first. 1814 to 1815. You govern it. Of course you govern it. It's what you do. You improve the roads. You reform the administration. You build a small navy. You are emperor of 12,000 people and 224 square kilometers, and you run it with the same intensity you ran France. Then the 100 Days. March 1815, you escape Elba, land in southern France with 1,000 men, and march on Paris. The army sent to stop you joins you instead. You enter Paris 20 days after landing. Louis XVIII flees. For 100 days you are emperor again. Waterloo. June 18, 1815. 8 hours. The Prussians arrive at the critical moment. It is over. St. Helena. This is the final island. Not 224 square kilometers. 122 square kilometers. In the South Atlantic. 1,800 miles from the nearest continent. The British chose it specifically because it is unreachable. You are 45 years old when you arrive. You will die here at 51. The house they give you, Longwood, is damp. The climate is wet and cold. The British governor, Hudson Lowe, treats you not as an emperor in exile but as a prisoner under guard, which is what you are. You spend years fighting him over the terms of your captivity, the title, the correspondence, the visitors, the degree of freedom of movement, because fighting is what you do, and there is nothing else to fight. You dictate your memoirs. This is the most important thing you do on St. Helena. You construct the narrative of your own life with the same deliberate precision you brought to military campaigns and legal codes. The Napoleon of the memoirs is not the Napoleon of the historical record. He is the Napoleon you want history to receive. The defender of the revolution. The man who unified Europe's legal chaos. The victim of British jealousy and coalition fear. The narrative travels. The real Napoleon dies in 1821. The Napoleon of the memoirs survives and becomes, within 30 years, the basis of a cult that puts his nephew on the throne of France. The rule at level 8. The story you tell about yourself is the last power you have. And if you are good enough at it, the story outlives everything else. There are no more levels. There are no more campaigns. There are no more crowns to place on your own head. You sit in the damp house on the island at the edge of the world. You dictate. You wait. The island doesn't care who you were. That is the final cost. The cycle continues. Somewhere tonight, a boy from the wrong country is sitting in a room full of people who speak a language he is still learning. He is the outsider. He knows he is the outsider. He can feel it in the way the conversation moves around him, rather than including him. He is doing the math. He is calculating which of his disadvantages can be turned into advantages, if approached correctly. He is reading the room the way you once read terrain. He is identifying the position that controls everything else. He doesn't know about the island yet. He doesn't know about the 600,000 men and the snow and the river crossing and the 8 hours at Waterloo. He doesn't know what the crown weighs. He thinks the story ends at Notre Dame. It doesn't. But he'll find out. They always find out. And by the time they do, they're already past the point where knowing would have changed the decision. That's what it costs. Every level. Every campaign. Every island. Now I need your answer in the comments. Level 6, the Russian campaign. You know it's a mistake going in. You go anyway. Is that the definition of greatness or the definition of hubris? Because I've been thinking about it, and I genuinely cannot separate the two in this case. If this one hit subscribe, because we have more worlds to walk through, and none of them end where you think they end. See you in the next one.